So good evening. Great to see everyone. I'm Larry Jameson, Dean at the Perelman School of Medicine, and I'm delighted to have this panel discussion about entrepreneurship and medicine. And we're fortunate that Mitch Blutt, who has founded this lectureship, will actually be participating and interviewing William Hait today. This is a really interesting time in medicine, and we need as much innovation and entrepreneurship as we ever have. This lectureship is one of many ways that Mitch has supported our activities here at the school and the university, along with his wife, Margot. So they've provided a scholarship for the MBA program. They've also provided 3 professorships to the university, including one here at the School of Medicine. And that linkage to different schools in many ways reflects Mitchell's connection to the university. As an undergraduate, he created his own career path in psychology and anthropology and statistics and biology. I may be missing some other interests of yours. Little philosophy in that. And then as a medical student, also pursued the MBA degree, and that has in many ways charted his career path, which leads him now to Consonance Capital as one of the co-founders and currently the CEO of Consonance Capital and Consonance Capital Management after a previous career at JP Morgan in healthcare management. Just spectacular. And then an engagement with the Penn Medicine Board, the University Board of Trustees, and he's been both a formal and informal advisor to me and many others in our leadership team as we've taken on different topics in entrepreneurship. And this lectureship gives us an opportunity to share these ideas more broadly. I mentioned to Mitchell coming in that it seems like an entrepreneurship day here since we had Rod Wong here earlier to meet with some of the students that he's worked with in the Penn Health X program, and there'll be a big announcement coming out imminently about a gift that he's provided to endow that program long term. And it's been a terrific way, in addition to this lectureship and others, of attracting students with an interest in entrepreneurship to come and participate in our school. Now, I think many of you are aware that at Penn Medicine, we've been sharply focused on what originally we referred to as translational research for at least 15 years. It, of course, goes back longer than that, but the sharp focus for about 15 years with the formation of the Institute for Translational Medicine and Therapeutics, ITMAT. And it's really started to come to life through the Penn Center for Innovation, through our partnership with the private sector and commercialization efforts. I think Kevin Mahoney might refer at the end to some of the commercialization efforts and how we've connected with those entities. But it's entirely appropriate in this spectrum of activities that I mentioned the J&J J-Pod, which is over at the Pennovation Center. I think this might have been one of the first J-Pods that was founded. And that brings me to a brief introduction of William Hait, who is currently at Johnson & Johnson, been there since 2007, where he's held a number of roles, first in medical oncology, then later was involved in some of their global programs, and most recently, a sharp focus on disruptive innovation and entrepreneurship, which I think is a healthy activity to make sure that large corporations are not only carrying out their productive business, but trying to look ahead and identify where the next activities will come from. So we look forward to hearing from you. He's trained as a medical oncologist. Much of his career was at Yale, I think working particularly in breast and lung cancer, chief of the Division of Medical Oncology and associate director of their cancer center before moving to Rutgers to head up, in fact, I think, the cancer center there before joining J&J. So just a fabulous background as a physician, now working in industry in a number of roles. And I should note that Mitch Blutt is still active clinically on the faculty at Weill Cornell, so they really bring both perspectives. So let me invite the two of you to come up, and we look forward to your interaction together, and I'm sure we'll have some questions from the audience. Our students are busy in classes down the hall. Some may appear in the back as we proceed. Don't let them interrupt.
Thank you, Larry. Hi, Bill.
Mitch,
How are you today, Bill?
I'm well, thank you.
Okay, that pretty much concludes our interview. I just want to make sure I have my notes here. It's an honor to have you. We really appreciate your being here. Thank you, everyone in the audience. I'll just say, just given Larry's introduction, we've been doing this lectureship for several years now. We might be into the 8th year or something like that. And it's fantastic, the different perspectives that we've learned and gathered. And I always say that the audience for events like this is not the majority of the Penn Medicine and University of Pennsylvania healthcare-oriented community, but it's a very determined and passionate component, and it's a growing, both the passion and the size seems to be growing over time. So I guess that's good. I hope that's good. I'm mostly interested in asking you about how it was being on the tennis team when you were an undergraduate here, because I'm still working on my game. But I'd like you to tell us a little bit about how you thought about your career from the very beginning, from the earliest point in your life when you first thought about career, what you wanted to be, as parents and grandparents would often ask. How did it get from the first kernel to once you at least were thinking about becoming a doctor?
Thank you, Mitch. Well, first, let me thank you and the organizers for inviting me. It's a true honor, and I'm very happy to be here. It's actually coincidental that you brought up tennis, because I had no real clue what I was going to do for my career. I was busy playing both basketball and tennis at Penn, so there wasn't much time for anything else. But one day on the tennis court, a guy came over to me. He was a faculty member here at Penn. His name was Dov Gorshein. He was a former Israeli Davis Cupper. He used to work out with the team. And he said, what are you doing this summer? I said, I don't even know what I'm doing tonight, let alone this summer. He said, well, why don't you come work for me and we'll play tennis every day? I said, okay. I never asked him actually what he did, but he was on the faculty of the medical school. He was working on red blood cell production and how stem cells differentiated into red cells. And I became so interested in it that he was having trouble getting me to play tennis, which of course was the problem. He didn't want me to. That's the only reason he hired an undergraduate to work for him in the summer. But it was through Dov that I became very interested in medical research. And good fortune was that our collaborator, Joanne Jepson, was the chief of Hem-Onc at the Women's Medical College. And although I had very little time and effort in the classroom, Dr. Jepson figured, well, let's take a risk on this guy, and she got me into the MD PhD program there, and I was one of 25 men in a class of 100 at Women's, and it was a great experience, quite frankly.
Fantastic. It's endless. When I ask people that question, it's almost a 100% frequency that people talk about a mentor or some form of mentor. And in this world of the interface between healthcare economics, business policy, entrepreneurship, industry, a lot of people are seeking mentors because it is still an unusual path, somewhat of a unique path. So thanks for sharing that. When you were in medical school, how much did you think about where you were going? Was it an academic career? That's certainly where you went. Was that where you were first thinking you would go?
Yeah, I was really interested in research. I had a phenomenal PhD advisor, and much to my surprise, I actually became very interested in medicine. And then it was sort of the doctor's dilemma. How are you going to spend your time? Are you going to have a career in the laboratory? Or are you going to have a career taking care of patients? Or could you do both? I couldn't make up my mind, so I wound up doing both. And have always enjoyed it. And in fact, back in those days, it was more plausible to do both. There was a way to carve out time from your medical duties, your clinical duties, to continue to do laboratory research. So I found it very exciting. In fact, it was interesting because in the MD PhD program at Yale, which I was an advisor to, the students were always caught up in, well, if we don't do full-time laboratory, they would say, we're never going to be as good as George Pilati. So George was on the faculty at Yale. He won the Nobel Prize. He discovered the ribosome. And they said, and if we don't do full-time medicine, we'll never be as good as Tom Duffy. And of course, Tom Duffy was this unbelievable clinician. And I used to say to them, look, if you were full-time in the lab, you're not going to be as good as George Pilati. And if you're full-time in the clinic, you're not going to be as good as Tom Duffy anyway. So just do what you love to do, and it'll all turn out just fine. And I hope some of them took my advice.
Well, I'm sure many have, and maybe some more are today. And by the way, if you have questions, try to hold them. We're going to have a question period at the end of this discussion. If it's a burning question, flag your arm, et cetera. But most likely, we will take questions after these remarks. So tell us about how you developed a cancer center from nothing.
Yeah. Nothing to it. So it was a very pivotal moment for me. I had become the chief of medical oncology at Yale a few years before, which was a great honor. Some of you may know that chemotherapy was discovered at Yale with Goodman and Gilman working on mustard derivatives. And as a result, they began needing to test nitrogen mustard in patients. The first few patients were actually treated on the surgical ward. And they really had no people on the medical side who actually studied medical oncology. There was no such thing at the time. So they created a joint program between the Department of Pharmacology and the Department of Medicine, which became literally the first section of what became medical oncology. So to get that job, I think I was the third chief in history there. It was a phenomenal honor. It was just great, and we had unbelievable faculty and students, postdocs. But my mother who lived in New Jersey, was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. And like all patients diagnosed with ovarian cancer, or almost all, they're always diagnosed with advanced disease. And as we looked carefully through places close to home, there was no place in New Jersey that could deliver the kind of therapy that she needed. So we took her to Yale, where she got her surgery or chemotherapy with a phenomenal group in the gynecologic oncology department. And I watched my mother and father come back and forth over 5 years, getting their care, and the burden it took on the family and everyone involved, the friends who would have difficulty visiting. And she passed away from her disease, and right shortly thereafter, I got a call from the dean of a medical school I had never heard of, called the Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. It's sad, I'm from New Jersey. And they said, we'd like to start a cancer center in New Jersey. We have a planning grant from the NCI, and we're looking for a director. And I thought to myself, if we could pull this off, it would be amazingly important for people, because cancer is not a disease that travels well, right? It's not like getting your hip fixed and you go home and get rehab. Much more complicated. So I went down and I looked at the opportunity, and I told the dean, well, I don't think so. And I got back, and my friends at Yale said, well, where were you? I said, I was in New Jersey looking at a job, and they all laughed. And I thought to myself, well, this could have been one of the greatest opportunities I ever passed up. Coincidentally, the dean was at an event last night where I gave a talk. He then called me about 3 months later. He said, look, we finished the search, but we just wanted to check in with you one more time. And so I decided to take a second look, and I joined. And there were 4 people, a nurse, happens to now be my wife, who's here, an administrator. One of the early nurses was Regina Cunningham, by the way, is now at Penn, of course, and a social worker, and that was really it. And we had this 3-year planning grant. We were one of 15 universities that had planning grants, and miraculously, the only one who converted into NCI designation in that first period was us. And it was quite an effort, tremendous amount of fun, because at a place like Robert Wood Johnson Medical School, they didn't have 100 strong programs all competing. But when the dean said, we're going to make one center that I'm really going to put resources into, it was fantastic. The degree of collaboration between the department chairs and the other institutes, and that's how we formed the Cancer Center. We followed the instructions for NCI Cancer Center support grants very, very carefully, and we received the designation. We were sort of the poster child at the time. And recently, I was told that this will never be duplicated because we became comprehensive 2 or 3 years later. And now there's a rule that you have to go in for at least your 2nd or 3rd cycle before you can apply to be comprehensive. So I'm told that this will be a record that will never be broken.
Ah.
So it's a one record.
That's a good one. That's a Hall of Famer.
Yeah.
So I'm just speculating that, and tell me if I'm wrong or partially right, that that experience, because it had so many aspects of a business build. You built an organization, a facility, a program, a service-providing entity from a startup, from nothing. I'm guessing that might have had some influence on your ultimate thinking about getting into industry, or what was the transition?
I think the experience where I actually had to manage a P&L was an attribute.
I want to tell them what a P&L is. There are some people here who
Right,
might not
profit and loss sheet.
have an income statement.
Right. I think it was that experience that helped Johnson & Johnson think, well, hiring an academic guy might not be that terrible. He had some experience. So that was important experience, no question. We were a ship on our own bottom. We had to pay all of our expenses. We collected our revenue from the practice. There was a dean's tax, but it was really like running a small business that grew dramatically over time. It grew tremendously. When I started, we used to sit around waiting for a patient to show up. Literally, when I left, about 12 years, 13 years later, we were closing in on 100,000 patient visits a year. So it just took off like crazy. But the switch to thinking about the pharmaceutical industry was my lab, which was always interested in translational research. I was realistic enough to know that if you really wanted to bring something further than what you could do in the lab, you would have to be involved in the pharmaceutical industry, either go into it or collaborate seriously. But it was one person who pushed me very, very hard, and that was Roy Vagelos, someone you may know. And Roy and I were working on a commission for Governor McGreevey, and I got to know him very well. And he said, you should go into the pharmaceutical industry. I said, why would I ever do that? He said, no, I insist. I'm going to have you meet my headhunter that I used at Merck, and you need to talk to him. So I said, okay, if you insist. And he was in New York, so I figured, well, my older daughter was living in New York, so what the hell, I'll go in, meet with the headhunter, get to see my daughter. And go in, meet the headhunter. He says to me, you have a very impressive CV, but you're too old for the pharmaceutical industry. So I said, that's okay, I wasn't really interested in the first place. So it didn't start off that well, but ultimately I was able to get the position at J&J.
And what do you remember? I'm sure you do. What was the hook? What changed? What made you interested?
Well, there were a couple of, the biggest thing was impact. You know, I always thought, you know, my passion had always been research. I just loved being with the students and the postdocs and looking over the data and studying the data, designing these. It was just fabulous. But as everyone knows who's in research, it can be very frustrating. You know, 99% of the time things don't go well, you go back and forth. But then when you'd go to clinic and see your patients, it was very gratifying because you were always doing something to help somebody. And so it was a great balance. But I said to myself at that point, well, if I really want to have impact, and I had a reasonable sized practice, but if I really wanted to have impact and combine my interest in research and doing things for patients, then maybe I should listen to Roy and try out the pharmaceutical industry and see how it goes. So that's really was the impetus. Because the Cancer Center was supported, actually founded by a gift from Johnson & Johnson and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, I knew many of the executives. So I had a sense of the culture. I was very worried about going into industry and things I would hear, you know, about the dark side and the culture. But J&J has almost an unbelievable culture based on the Johnson & Johnson Credo, and it's not fake, it's actually real. And so I figured I'll give it a try.
And just one more question on that point of transition. I reflect upon, you know, similar juncture in my career when some of the things Larry was talking about, when I went, did my fellowship, business school, and then actually took a position, in my case, in the healthcare investment industry. But I got ridiculed a little bit. That might be too strong a term, but definitely I felt, you know, among my academic medical colleagues, in this case, many faculty members at Cornell where I'd done my residency, you know, there were some comments, questions, et cetera. I'm guessing you felt the same from your academic colleagues, particularly senior colleagues.
A little bit, but you know, at that point, things were beginning to change a little bit. People in academics more and more were thinking about industry, especially those who are in translational medicine. It really seemed like less of a horrible thing to do. I mean, back in the days at Yale, it was, you know, you were persona non grata if you've talked to anyone from industry. That really began to evolve. And by the time I moved in 2007, things were much, they're coming along.
And so you're now into industry. Let's say, put yourself in the early years of your time in the pharmaceutical industry. How would you say your medical training, your PhD training helped prepare you for those roles? Was it, and what percentage of, if it was helpful, which I'm guessing you're going to say it was at least somewhat helpful, what percentage of what you did, and even to this day do you think are benefited by your medical and PhD training?
Yeah. So I'm absolutely convinced that, at least for me, having serious training in the laboratory with a very basic scientist, and then having superb clinical training under Sam Thier at Yale, I was well grounded in the two areas, clinical medicine and basic research. And I felt that's a very important foundation, especially when you're stepping into the pharmaceutical industry where you're dealing with, and the way we were structured in oncology to start at J&J, we had end-to-end, so I had discovery right through launch and life cycle management for the drugs. So you really were hearing very fundamental research all the way through phase 3 clinical trials and beyond. And so understanding the science and being able to evaluate data was absolutely critical, And understanding where the unmet medical needs were critical. So I think that training was essential. But I think at the end of the day, the most important training that I had was during my PhD, because I always look back on it, and that's where I learned how to think. You know, and I could apply that when I finished up I went into clinical training. It was so important because I would never know all the facts that, everything that was in the latest New England Journal or, the Journal of Clinical Oncology, that my colleagues who were doing nothing else. But the ability to think through problems, both in clinical medicine and then when I entered the pharmaceutical industry, was extremely helpful and continues to be helpful, as you can imagine.
And just maybe one more question on that transition. And again, I can speak from my career. I did struggle with, I'm going to ask you if you had the same experience. I did struggle in the first few years. I still struggle a little bit with the intensity of capitalism, if you will,
Right.
Which is clearly not prevalent, not the predominant mood in the academy. Yes. And so how did you reconcile that? Was that a challenge?
It was a challenge. I found it different, and the pace. I thought I was working as hard as I could in academics, but I never really knew what hard work was until I joined the pharmaceutical industry, because you're on a conveyor belt. I mean, you have project managers all over you, and they have all these dashboards. Well, why isn't this one going well, and why aren't we accruing to this trial? I mean, when I became head of Janssen R&D for all of pharmaceuticals, we had to launch 2 drugs every year to the market to stay afloat. And that's not simple. And the intensity of that is really something. And I had huge misperceptions. I thought that when I joined to be head of the oncology therapeutic area, I'd just have a bigger lab. And I'd tell everybody what to do. And it would be terrific. And I'd have all these chemists and biotechnologists. Of course, it was nothing like that at all. So it is a real adjustment. And quite frankly, it's not for everybody. Mm-hmm. But my sense was, if you keep your eye on the ball and know that what the end result is a product that can help hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people, all that other stuff is just how you get there. That's the process of how you get there.
And just one more nuance of that question. Did you ever feel that you need to push back at corporate and say, no, that's not in the interest of patients, or no, maybe we could get that product over the finish line, but I don't think that's the right medical thing to do, or something like that?
So I would say one thing that at J&J I've never seen happen, in fact, I've seen the opposite. If there's something that someone brings up that is important commercially but not good for a patient, that becomes what's called the Credo Issue. And that's the end of the discussion. There's no further discussion. We do what's best for the patient, always. And I'm sure people have questions about some of the recent stuff in the news, but I can tell you that's the culture. Where you do get into arguments is when your commercial colleagues tell you the indications you should pursue because there's a larger market. Right. And that's where you have to push back. And sometimes you have to push back very hard. And my argument was, well, we could do that, but you won't have a drug. Or we could go here and you'll have a drug, you choose. And almost always, especially my colleagues on the commercial side were fantastic. They basically took the position, well, this guy appears to know what he's doing. Let's give him a chance, and our team a chance. It's a huge team. Just another thing that's so different. In Janssen R&D, which I led, I had 10,000 people in the group, and our budget was approaching $7 billion a year, just to give you an idea. So it's a massive undertaking. And you got to rely on these people to do the right thing, and you have to get out in front, fight off the interference, so our guys and gals can do the work.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Just a couple more questions from me, and then I'll open it up to the audience. So if you're thinking of a question, your opportunity will come shortly. When you got to J&J and took on key responsibility, you had some work to do, because the pharma components of J&J needed some repair.
Right, going off the cliff, as they said.
So Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. I, of course, was very naive about all this. I just decided they were giving me a chance to join a great company, and I wanted to do it. I hadn't looked at balance sheets or anything. I just wanted to start the oncology therapeutic area. And when I arrived, I started realizing that the pharmaceutical sector was in some trouble. We weren't growing. And that's how we're measured, by growth. And so I was put in. My job was to build an oncology therapeutic area. A few interesting things happened during the interview process with the person who became my boss, a fabulously brilliant guy. At the end of the interview, he said to me, "Do you have any questions?" I said, "Yeah. How committed is J&J to oncology?" And he looked at me very seriously. He said, "Oh, we're very committed. But in 3 years, if you don't have anything, we won't be so committed." Right? So what we started with, we had 200 people and $200 million. Now, by industry standards, that's a tiny group, right? So give you a sense, we had 19 people working on large molecule oncology, monoclonal antibodies. Genentech had 900. And I kept saying, well, we're probably not 45 times smarter than they are, so this is going to be tough. So we needed a strategy. We needed a strategy. So here's what we decided to do. And it was risky. We said, okay, we can't possibly continue to do what we're doing, which is trying to compete with Novartis, all the really great corporations in oncology who had much greater resources. So I said, here's what we're going to do. And there was enormous pushback at first. I said, we're going to take 100 people, and you're only going to work on prostate cancer, and here's $100 million. And we take 100 people, and you're only going to work on B-cell malignancies, and here's $100 million. And I only want to hear about the tumor microenvironment. That's it. And you could imagine, since we were doing everything that everyone else was doing, that didn't go over all that well, but I said, there's no other way that we can compete. And then I said, and the strategy is going to be very simple. In the prostate group, find out from all the leading prostate people in the world, the leading researchers, what are the most important pathways and the 3 most important targets. That's it. Same thing for B-cell malignancies, and we'll either build the drugs or buy the drugs. Doesn't matter, but that's what we're going to do. Come back in 6 weeks, let me know how it's going. And it was remarkable. We said we wanted to be top 5 oncology company. We started in 2007. We said by 2015, we were number 16 or something. The only drug we really had was Procrit, which ran into trouble anyway, so we really had no drugs. We had a license ex-US to Velcade. By 7 years later, we were number 4 in the world. And today in oncology, I think we're either number 2 or number 3 in the world. So just that focus was remarkable. And it also changed another paradigm. It didn't start with the discovery group doing research, finding a target, making a drug, and handing it off. We had an end-to-end situation where the clinical people were involved in the get-go with the basic scientists, everyone working together trying to figure these things out. And that began with Zytiga and Darzalex and a whole series of drugs, and Imbruvica, we began pulling the company up. And my boss then moved up to become chief scientific officer for the corporation, so I became head of R&D, and we used the same principles for the rest of the farm group. And we decreased from 33 disease areas to 11. So we had to eliminate 22 disease areas, but we were able to take that huge budget and apply it to 11 disease areas with an incredible group of people, and it was very hard to beat us. And today, I'm told that in new drug sales, we're number 1 in the US, and next year we'll be number 1 in the world. So it worked.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it worked.
It's just fantastic. Let's take the last few minutes to talk about 2 projects. One's at J&J, one Larry referenced is partly here at Penn.
Yeah.
But let's start with the World Without Disease Accelerator.
Right.
I think everyone would, if they don't know about it, would be interested in just understanding what that mission is.
Yeah. So part of it really originated by the fact that I'm a medical oncologist and spent many, almost 30 years taking care of patients. And as you know, it can be a difficult area, even in the patients who do very well. because when a patient is told they have cancer, it turns their world completely upside down. And then between surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, new therapies, and the toxicities and the emotional toxicities that patients go through, it's very, very tough. And so I came to the conclusion some years back that we have this acute problem, patients in front of our eyes, we have to take care of them and develop drugs. But I never heard anyone who wanted to get cancer, or for that matter, any other disease. But yet, we spend an enormous amount of time and effort developing treatments for patients with established disease. And we spend a de minimis amount of time and effort and resources on prevention and intercepting a disease-causing process. So because we had the luxury of growth, this extraordinary growth within Janssen, I was able to carve out a group, and we called it the World Without Disease Accelerator. And not everyone thought it was a great idea, but the idea was to start investing in understanding how we could prevent a disease or intercept a disease, or worse come to worse, cure a disease. And so I have a couple slides. I don't know if they'll all work, but I'll show you one. So and here's what we would present to the higher-ups at J&J. This is a 16th century painting of the Fountain of Youth. And as you all know, if you bathed in the Fountain of Youth or drank the waters, you would achieve immortality. Well, the fact of the matter is we haven't achieved immortality. Very difficult to do. Neanderthals lived to about age 30,000 years ago. The Middle Ages, we got into our 40s, then the bubonic plague knocked it down to about 40. Today, most of us, if we're relatively healthy, will live well into our 80s. Women live a little longer than men. The problem is that diseases, we begin to accumulate diseases on average at about age 40. So if we're going to live longer into our 80s, and we start accumulating diseases by age 40, we're going to live longer, but perhaps unhealthier lives. So we came up with this idea that how do we get to live a life free of disease? And we even came up with the term, immorbidity. Living a life free of disease. It sounded good. It was a sales pitch, a part of industry. We need a sales pitch.
Pick that up.
We need a sales pitch. And we're going to live a life free of disease. And then the question was, well, how are we going to do that? And so we sent off this group, maybe 20 people from different parts of J&J. Remember, we have 3 sectors. So we have behavioral psychologists in the consumer group. They know why someone picks up Neutrogena rather than L'Oreal. I have no idea how they know this, but that's what they do. We have one of the, if not the largest medical device group in the world, and we have a big pharmaceutical group. Took people from each of them, we sent them off and said, okay, tell us how we're going to reach a world without disease and morbidity. And what they came back with, remarkably enough, was this: we want to be more like our cars. And I said, what are you talking about? They said, well, when our cars roll off the assembly line, all the specs of all the vital parts of the car are known. And they're embedded with these hundreds of sensors, as you can see in the diagram. And if you the car begins to go out of spec, your check engine light comes on. And you get, that information gets downloaded into a computer, and the car gets adjusted. And now, today, automatically adjusted in some cars before the car ever breaks down. And we want to be more like our cars. So we said, okay, well, that sounds interesting. And the idea is it would take a very long time. So let's get started now. What do we have to do starting today to realize this by 2030 or something like that? And so they've been at it. And we've come up with a variety of remarkable things. As you could imagine, if you put very smart people in a room somewhere, they will think of good things. And I think I have this slide, and I may have to stand up to get the video to work, but here was one that I wanted to tell you about because I think it's just remarkable what's possible today. So we focused on lung cancer with the 3 sectors, and we asked, well, why can't we cure lung cancer? And the reason is we diagnose it too late. So, okay, how do we diagnose it earlier? And then studies began to appear showing that low-dose CT scanning in people at high risk, heavy smokers, greater than 35 pack years, if they underwent CT scanning, and were intervened, they were caught earlier and had an increase in survival. The problem with low-dose CT scanning is they pick up literally now an epidemic of peripheral nodules, and no one knows what to do with them. And if you have to go through the chest, or you have to, either a biopsy or a thoracoscopy or a thoracotomy, it's a real problem. So we were introduced to this company called Auris. They're on the West Coast, small company, started by Fred Moll. Fred started Intuitive, right? The Da Vinci robot.
That's the surgical robot company.
Yeah, the Da Vinci robot. And he showed us this device, which hopefully I'll be able to show you in a moment. Here it comes. And here's the device. And what happens here is you take a CT scan, you load all the data, it's very rich in data, into the robot. And then what happens is the robot, using artificial intelligence, it reproduces the airways and shows you where the lesion is. And using an Xbox controller, which the younger people in the room have used, I'm sure, you can get your way. In every bifurcation, it tells you which way to go, left or right. And you watch, it snakes its way out into the periphery. And you can do this throughout the whole lung. So I called it pulmonoscopy, another sales pitch, like colonoscopy. And as it moves out into the periphery, you see the airways are getting smaller. Again, the navigation system tells you which way to go. And you'll see in a moment that the scope begins to telescope. You see it gets smaller, and it actually gets more flexible. And it can, as it goes out, literally, it can get to the pleura. It can snake its way all the way, there's the lesion, all the way to the lesion. And you'll see in a moment, when it gets to the lesion, this remarkable engineering group was able to make the device stiffen. So now it stays in place. So when the needle comes out to do the biopsy, which you'll see in a moment, it doesn't move around. It stays in place. Inside, in the bore of the needle, within the bore, you can put a confocal laser microscope, a fiber optic cable. Can do actual microscopy to see what you're doing. You can ablate with energy, or you can inject an oncolytic virus. These are the things we're working on now. So we convinced J&J that we should buy this company, part of the World Without Disease Lung Cancer Initiative, because this is how we're going to diagnose earlier and cure more patients. And it cost us $3.4 billion up front, 1.8 in buyouts. But that's the advantage of working in a big company. And we were able to sell the vision to them. And now we own the
When
company.
when was that transaction?
This year,
completed?
earlier this year, yeah.
The venture capitalists were pretty happy.
Oh,
who
very.
were investors in the company before the acquisition.
Very happy.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's just fantastic. When do you think this might be in clinical use?
So it's on the market now.
Yes.
It's actually on the market, and right now just for diagnostics.
I got it.
Right. So, and interestingly, very interestingly, because there's competition always, there's demand, and the problem right now is supply chain. We can't make them fast enough, which is a good problem to have.
Good problem.
Very good problem to have.
Good problem. We're officially a little bit past the time where we're supposed to open to questions. Maybe just a word on JPod at Philadelphia.
Yeah, at Pennovation.
Yeah.
So one of the areas that I'm in charge of is called the JLabs. And the JLabs was an idea that we had back in the day, only about 8 years ago. It's hard to believe. Venture, you would know, Mitch, but others might not know. Venture found investing in biotech a little too risky. And there was hard to believe now. And there were very few incubators around the world. So we decided we would start an incubator in our La Jolla facility, and we would have a no strings attached program, bring entrepreneurs in, get them started, help them start their company, provide them with anything they needed to get them going. Today, there are 600 JLabs companies, and we have 13 or 14 around the world. It's quite remarkable. And another part of this that we wanted to do was partner with great academic institutions, we call them innovation hubs. And so Penn was an obvious one. When Pennovation was being formed, we said this would be a great place for us to put a JLab, but since it's in a Penn facility, it's called the JPod. And so I think they told me we have 13, could be 17 companies that are now JLabs within Pennovation. And it's a remarkable ecosystem because just from Penn itself, you have a lot of entrepreneurial things going on, but other universities around and even not so close have come in to Pennovation, and we're very excited to work with them. The idea, the no strings idea, a little bit of sales and marketing. There are no strings, sort of, but we're closer to them than anyone else. And usually they come to us first when they want to do a deal. So it's a very clever idea, and we're very happy that we're in Pennovation.
Fantastic,
Yeah.
great. Questions from the audience for Dr. Hait?
Yeah.
Please.
I'm a retired medical oncologist,
Yeah.
practiced for 40 years, and spent most of my career in clinical research. And was involved in a number of chemo prevention trials,
Yeah.
which never really did very well.
No.
So the pulmonoscopy is early detection. Where do you see a place for chemo prevention?
Yeah. So one of the things that we realized very, very quickly was that there was so little investment in research in pre-malignant conditions. I remember we did a quick look at PubMed. We looked at how many papers we could find in PubMed on multiple myeloma. There were thousands. We then asked, well, how many on smoldering myeloma or MGUS? There were a couple hundred. Right. And if we look at the number of clinical studies that are ongoing over a 10-year period, there are thousands in advanced disease. And we could find only a couple of hundred in prevention. And the problem is, if you're not investing in research, you don't understand the biology. You don't really know the targets. So you're in many ways shooting in the dark. And the pioneers in chemoprevention understood certain things with relatively limited baseline research to draw upon. So the retinoids and other things, green tea and curcumin and a variety of things that were studied, had some evidence, but nothing like what we understand today in cancer biology. In fact, Arnie Levine, who used to chair, I think, one of the boards here, and I wrote a paper not long ago about this problem published in Science, and we originally called it the complexity of genomic complexity, because everyone now is interested in sequencing tumors and then sequencing first relapse and sequencing second relapse. And what do you see? It gets more and more complex, which is incredibly interesting biologically. But I'm sitting there thinking, well, that's not so great if you're a patient. So I remember asking a very established, very incredibly good guy who was presenting his work at a Stand Up to Cancer board meeting. And I said, have you ever thought about applying these technologies to pre-malignancies? And he looked at me very seriously. He said, well, why would I do that? My patients never die of pre-malignancies. I said, exactly. So this is what we're up against. But I think the idea that we generate the knowledge so we'll know how to target. And there's there's an important study done last year by Novartis called the CANTOS study. It published in the New England Journal. It was a cardiovascular outcome study using a very potent anti-inflammatory drug, an anti-IL-1 beta called canakinumab. It was over 10,000 patients randomly assigned to canakinumab or placebo with cardiovascular MACE outcomes, right? But no patient who entered the study had known cancer. But many of them were heavy smokers. So they were smart enough to pre-specify to take a look at the incidence of cancer in the subjects who enrolled. Comparing the placebo to canakinumab, there was a 67% decrease in the incidence of cancer and a 77% decrease in the mortality from cancer from a very potent anti-IL-1 beta. So now we're beginning to think about things like the inflammasome and how that fits. So as more knowledge comes, we'll be able to get at it hopefully in a more effective way. Yeah.
Question in the back.
So a question from the perspective of a student. Your career is not dissimilar to many of those who are now, thanks. Your career
arc is similar to many of those former academics who are now in industry. And often those of us, I think, speaking at least from my own experience, are often told, stay in academia as long as you can. And if you're really still interested in industry, then go later. And as you mentioned, one of the really beautiful things about being involved in both spaces is the ability to both see the patient in front of you, but then have access to enormous impact afterwards. And I'm curious if you see now that there are these numerous partnerships between the academy and industry, how there are earlier on-ramps for folks who are med students, residents, fellows, postdocs, and others.
Yeah. So I think that I would maybe 2 points. First, there's been a lot of news in the news about conflicts of interest between academic investigators and industry. And it hits the front page of the New York Times and the whole world explodes. My number one concern is that this doesn't disrupt that bond because you can't develop drugs. You can't develop them in academia alone, you can't develop them in industry alone. We're completely dependent on each other. So it's very important that there's not an overreaction to a couple of bad things that might have occurred. That would be one. The other is the advice you're getting to stay in academics as long as you can. I would say that it's really good to have a solid grounding in academics for a couple of reasons. One is you'll become a more sophisticated physician, you'll become a more sophisticated scientist, and if you can enter into the industry at a higher level than a starting level, you'll find it, I think, more rewarding, because the starting positions in industry, you're on a team, you're contributing to the team, everything's about a team, but you wouldn't have as much necessarily impact on the team. If you come in at a little higher level, you'll have more impact, which will be more rewarding. And to get to that higher level, a little greater experience in academics, I think, is a wise idea.
I think we have time for between 0 and 1 more question. Yes.
First, thank you so much for coming. I have a question about JLab. I know there's around 13 JLabs around the world, and there's JLab in Shanghai and probably the only JLab in Asia. I was wondering, what is the strategy of JLab in China and Asia in general?
Yeah. So we opened the JLabs in Shanghai this year, and remarkably, the day we opened, we had 32 resident companies. 32 resident companies. And to get into a JLab, you have to reach a certain level of, you have to pass through certain pretty rigorous criteria. And the fact that 32 companies, and we reviewed all of them, were at a level of innovation that could gain them entry into a JLab, because we spend a huge amount of money on the companies in JLabs, right? We want to do everything we possibly can to make the JLab companies successful. So the first thing that we found was the level of innovation in China is exploding. The level of venture capital in China is unbelievable, maybe too much, quite frankly. But compared to 10 years ago, when I first started visiting China seriously as part of J&J, there was a lot of Me Too, incremental innovation that was going on, which is not necessarily of great interest to a global pharmaceutical company, maybe more to the locals. But today, it's an explosion of innovation, of knowledge, of creativity, predictable, right? Completely predictable. And by placing our first JLabs in Asia, in Shanghai, it turned out it looks like a pretty good bet.
I think we're going to have to wrap up now. I saw there were a few more questions, but I'm just going to thank Bill Hait for your comments and remarks, and I think Kevin Mahoney will have the last words.
Good afternoon, good evening. My name's Kevin Mahoney. I'm the CEO of the health system, and I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you, Dr. Hait, for an enlightening and thoughtful discussion. Mitchell, as always, thanks for your leadership. As Larry mentioned earlier, Dr. Blutt is a true Penn citizen, and we gain from being with him every day. After this is finished, we're going to go out back through those doors and have a little party reception. We'll continue the conversation and hope you all can join us. I was going to do the top 10 reasons that J&J and Penn are united, but because there's a party outside the door, I cut it down to 4. So number 4, teamwork is a necessary condition for innovation to flourish. I think we heard that tonight. It is working at Penn. In the last year, couple of years, we had 528 patents in cell therapy, which makes us number 1 in the country. We've started 10 startup companies, brought about $650 million of venture capital into the city of Philadelphia, which is terrific. We have 8 FDA registrations from Penn products. As Bill mentioned, they hope for 2 a year. So the fact that the Penn scientists and research community could be behind 10 of those in the last 8 or 10 of those in the last couple of years is certainly remarkable. But most important, we've done 15 corporate alliances. They've brought $500 million of corporate-sponsored research into Penn. And number 1 on that list and some of the progress we're making has been Janssen. And we're just grateful to have that partnership. Number 3, innovation's how we get the costs down. And when I was watching the Bronc going through and thinking about a conversation I just had with Dr. Schnall on the number of incidental findings are coming through on high-speed CT and how that's actually increasing cost. Hearing things like the pulmonoscopy is just fantastic, and it's similar to what we're doing in Penn Health Tech and the Innovation Center led by Dr. Ash. So we're aligned there. Number 2, can I go back to that first slide we had?
Let's see. I may have the clicker. This one?
I think we all agree that Penn and J&J stand for a world where disease is eliminated, and a lot of the one-time treatments that we're working on with Janssen will get us there. But the number 1 reason we're all here tonight and that Penn and J&J agree is Dr. Hait is a phenomenal and extraordinary leader, and both companies, Penn and J&J, benefit from his leadership, and we appreciate that. Important in that conversation earlier that may have been missed was a comment that Dr. Hait made that ethics should always drive and be a guardrail on science and never let commercialization get ahead of us. So to that point, we brought you a book from the president of Penn that she recently authored with one of our great bioethicists, John Marino. Dr. Gutman signed the book for you, and we're just grateful to have you here tonight.
Thank you very much.
So thanks very much.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.